I truly feel embarrassed by all of this because, and indeed I feel like a bit of a fraud standing up here, and you'll figure that out by the time I finish. This is the second time I was invited to do the Jill McKenzie lecture, and I could not do it the previous occasion due to a conflict. But I feel very privileged to be asked to do it on this occasion. I knew Jill a little, and we met at several events that were aiming towards the foundation and so on. I knew and still know her husband very much better as one of the absolute pillars of the foundation and as a very distinguished historian of his own clan, which is the most objective kind of history it's possible to do. And one of the things I used to love doing at meetings was winding Alan up on the history of the Mackenzies. Yeah, we won't go into that. Not today. I don't have a PowerPoint, I'm proud to say. The power and the point is in the presentation. If it works, because sometimes your heat can let you down as much as a PowerPoint can let you down. What I'm going to do today, folks, is to talk a wee bit about the emigration process, because I think it affects many of us in this room, one way or another. Perhaps at some time in the past, sometime fairly recent, happening to people now, moving on to different places. But I don't think that the emigration process has changed very much since the first people left Scotland to come to Canada. And our first ones left pretty well known that the earliest Scottish colonial expedition in our history, if you take out Ireland and England, we attempted to colonise England actually, and then gave that up and went to Ireland. But we came to Canada first in 1622 in a very little known expedition that left Kirkcudbright on the Solway Firth. And it was a fiasco, but the point is that this is only 2 years after the Mayflower. So many of these early colonial schemes were failures. Many later ones were too, but we should keep that in mind. There's actually nothing wrong with failure, because each time somebody failed, they learned something about the next time. And so we're in early, just at the back of the French and some of the English, in the early 17th century. So the other thing I have to say, a thing that really got up my snout when I stayed here and lived here, was the problem that the Canadians have in isolating any particular ethnic group. This was I'll go into more of this later on, but it may not be the same now, but I think it is, that you're somehow, I was thinking about this when you were talking there about BC, there's a sense in which somehow as Canadians we're not supposed to separate out any particular group, unless maybe it's a recent one with lots of money to buy plenty of houses in Vancouver or something like that, right? Or maybe even Toronto, according to the Globe and Mail this week, because prices there are catching up with Vancouver. But I am unrepentant about this. I cannot really take a very objective view of the Scots, and actually I don't think we should. I think we should be shouting from the hilltops that the Scots did huge amounts for this country. They may not be doing it now, and that's fine. This is what history is. They did it in the past. We don't expect them to be carrying on in the same way in the present. And many Scots, after all, simply wanted to fit in. They didn't necessarily want to be doing Scottish things all the time. When I came here first to teach at Guelph, people kept asking me to come out and have dinner with a Scottish family that they know. And I said, I left 5 million of the buggers at home in Scotland. I want to meet some other kind of people, you know. But it never worked, and of course the other thing was Maggie Thatcher had just come to power, and I thought this would be a good time to get out of Scotland to get a perspective on my native country from afar. Boy, did I ever pick the wrong country for that, because Canada, you're tripping over Scots all over the place, and some of the most irritating variety. None of them associated with the foundation. I hasten to add. But I would say then that, I'm very fortunate to be a citizen of both Scotland and Canada. So folk from both places can criticise if they think I'm guilty of exceptionalism. At least for the moment. You may not know that if you've got a citizenship in this country, as from next month, you cannot get a Canadian passport unless you give up, essentially. What they want you to do is to take away your citizenship if you won't take a Canadian passport. You're okay if you're a Canadian, but if you're a made Canadian like me, as the guy on the West Coast said, the famous reporter said, I'm a Canadian by choice, and no like half of you buggers conceived in the back seat of a Buick in the 1950s. So if you are, from next time, we've got to decide as a family, because all of my family are Canadians, but we have to decide if we want to splash out to get a second passport in order to come here and visit the part of the family that's still here. Anyway, that's by the by. It might be suggested to historians, I think, especially Scottish ones, that emigration, like childbirth, should perhaps only be discussed by those who have actually experienced it. While many historians have vicariously known the pain of the event of emigration, few have actually felt the births of the pangs of parting. Some who have written on the subject almost regard emigrants, and this is from the Scottish end, as aliens, as sick members of the body politic, at best victims, at worst traitors, forgotten at departure and seldom celebrated or remembered. Many Scottish commentators have been conditioned by notions of famine, deprivation and clearance, of poor folk ruthlessly driven out against their wishes, usually wearing kilts. As it happens, the largest population loss in 19th century Scotland came from my three home counties of Dumfries, Kirkcudbright and Wigtonshire. And most people in this room will never have heard of that. Proportionately, we lost more people. The highest population in many communities in Dumfries and Galloway was hit in 1851 census, and we've gone backwards ever since. What I've been fascinated in for years, and I don't have an answer to this altogether, why on earth is it that the Gaels remember about every atrocity that perhaps was ever committed against them during the so-called clearances, and yet the people in the southwest of Scotland have completely lost the memory of large numbers of folk moving out. Quite strange. Sister Margaret MacDonnell of Antigonish, Nova Scotia, once told me that she had gone out interviewing people in Cape Breton, asking them for their memories or their traditions about the clearances. She couldn't find one person who had heard of them. A few years later, John Preble's book came out, and everybody was talking about the Highland clearances. I don't want to make a point out of this, I'm just saying that some things are fashionable at different times, and I think this was one of them. As it happens, I live in the southwest of Scotland. It's a highly deprived area, an unknown part of Scotland. So I'm trying to create a culture of victimhood so that we could get money out of the government and become a paradise. Nowhere in Scotland can become a paradise, don't we? Anyhow, in recent years, deluded politicians, we've heard about one of them coming here to Guelph actually, one of the most deluded of all, Jack McConnell. In recent years, deluded politicians have organised welcome home programmes aimed at the descendants of Scots abroad. And there have been ludicrous suggestions that a parliamentary apology should be preferred to the departed. There's little awareness of how the emigrant experience can be positive, liberating and exhilarating, and yet at the same time combined with guilt and sorrow. One thing that happens when you emigrate, folks, if you don't already know it, is that you're subjected to a hell of a lot of emotional blackmail, mainly from the nearest and dearest, the parents, the siblings, why do you want to leave us? What do you want to go away for? This is a great country, etc., etc. In most of my time here, I never really met any people of Scottish descent who ever wanted to go home to Scotland, permanently. And I remember doing a wee fake survey in the Army and Navy Club in Guelph, which is full of Scots, and asking them, if you don't want to go, why do you all go and listen to the soccer scores on a Saturday afternoon from Scotland, and find out there, and you have a drink of whiskey to celebrate, you do this, that and the next thing. Why don't you just go home? Well, if we went home, we wouldn't have 2 cars in the driveway, would we? We wouldn't have our swimming pool. We wouldn't have this, that and the next thing. It rains all the time. You never get a summer in Scotland. So they stay. And so this is one of the reasons why we've got this kind of weird association, where I think a lot of us love Scottish culture, but we're not very keen on Scotland itself. So just think about that. You maybe think I'm talking nonsense, and you're perfectly free to do so. But I actually am pretty sure there's some little bit of truth anyway in what I've mentioned. Of course, in the 19th century, there were many home-based opponents of emigration who manufactured horror stories circulated in newspapers and periodicals about emigrants who came to grief. People who never set foot outside of Britain published sentimental poems about the painful wrench of departure, ancient shepherds taking tearful farewells of beloved glens and mountains, while lamenting the virtues of poverty and the supposedly benign management of paternalistic landlords. Think of the famous painting by Fade, The Last of the Clan, where everybody's weeping and wailing as the ship goes away from land and what have you. Such poetry outlived the emigrants, surviving in song to survive to the present day in various effusions such as Caledonia or the White Heather Club or Kenneth McKellar, and all these kind of maudlin songs that we seem to somehow enjoy. But in contrast, Gaelic poetry emanating from these Scots popularly deemed to have suffered most in the process of population displacement is often upbeat and optimistic. A Gaelic poem, We Shall Go to America, and America in this period included Canada, anticipates that, and I quote, "We'll find friends there before us, now renowned professional men. Some of them are wealthy, though they hadn't a groat when they emigrated." That for me says it all. That you had the Gaels quite happy to emigrate, in fact. We had a PhD student at Glasgow who argued that the main reason that people were leaving the crofts and whatnot was through competition for rents. They were in fact ganging up on the weaker members of the community in order to take over their land. As their families got bigger, they needed somewhere else to grow crops and things. And that may well be true. The history of Scottish emigration matters because between 1700 and 1950, at least 2 million Scots, and probably more, departed to reside elsewhere. Everyone, irrespective of the success or otherwise they enjoyed abroad, represented a failure of the British state and the Scottish nation. It cannot be disputed that many of the temporary migrants returned home to invest vast fortunes made in North America or India. But if they had been, if all of those had been properly harnessed, these individuals and their talents had been properly harnessed, Scotland today might have been a very different place. It was quite interesting that last week, before I left, the Polish ambassador to the UK was quoted as saying that Poland should be grateful to Britain for employing so many young Poles, especially entrepreneurial types who've opened shops and things, all over the country. But, he said, there was no doubt that the 180,000 Poles in the British Isles had adversely had an effect on the Polish economy. I mean, you can't keep losing population and still build up an economy that you might be hoping for. And it is true that in Scotland, one of the so-called paradox of emigration is that Scots were emigrating not because of poverty, they were emigrating because the standard of living was rising in Scotland, and they were actually all, more or less all, achievers who saw the potential in emigration to make more money than they were making at home, to have a better property than they could make at home, to have a better place for their children. The Enlightenment has been mentioned. I think that emigration was the ultimate Enlightenment statement, because the Enlightenment is about progress, it's about knowledge, learning knowledge, it's about improvement of one's condition, it's about places new, it's about adventure. Emigration potentially captured all of these things for quite ordinary people who weren't very elevated or didn't have that much money to blow. This would be truly an Enlightenment adventure. And anticipating the creation of the Scottish Studies Foundation, Scots abroad were, from the 18th century on, generally celebrated as hard-working, trustworthy, fun-loving, optimistic, can-do communitarians with excellent organisational skills. And it's very noticeable, it's been very noticeable ever since I came to Canada, that whenever you went home to Scotland, you got the exact opposite. Lazy buggers, lying about. Fun-loving, what a joke. Trustworthy, optimistic, certainly not. They're born with pessimism in their bosoms. Can do? No. The most popular Scottish expression is, that'll no work. You can't do that. And so it goes. Excellent organisational skills. Well, the skills that work here don't seem to work at home. So, on the other hand, they were regarded as ideal immigrants in Canada because of their habits of thrift, industry, religiosity, and respect for education. Their social activities, as we've heard, such as meetings of the St Andrews Societies or curling competitions, complete with after-dinner songs and recitations, were widely reported in the press for other groups to emulate. Scots wrote extensively about their host country, for which such luminaries as Burns and Scott provided literary templates. Their sports were much admired and non-exclusive, such as ice hockey or shinny from shinty, golf, football, and above all, as again we've heard, Caledonian or Highland Games, which featured such democratic and therefore cheap activities such as putting the shot, tossing the caber, foot races, and other field sports. My favourite competition at these Highland Games was for the best dressed Highlander at his own expense. And usually, if he was lucky, he got 4 volumes of the poetry of Ossian as a prize. And I honestly wonder what it was like carting that home to the good lady. Yippee! Look what I got. It's not even translated. Or is it? Having said that, all just by way of introduction, I would like now to turn to what we're supposed to be looking at here today. And that is to move on a little, because some of this overlaps with the last speaker actually. I think what we should keep in mind here with Scottish culture disappearing in Canada, you should really keep firmly in mind that Scottish culture is disappearing in Scotland as well. That might sound like a stupid thing to say, but I've often tried this on our students. On a daily basis, Scottish students are exposed to far more American culture than they are Scottish culture. You know? You cannot be guaranteed to turn on the radio and listen to a Scottish song at any time of the day or night. Whereas you can certainly be sure of listening to American music of one kind or another. And then you can just think of that, just multiply the examples by yourselves. It goes to graphic novels and comic books and all sorts of things, clothing, sports even. The horrible, horrible uniforms that young kids are wearing now with baseball hats as many baseball hats in Scotland as there are practically in Canada. And they don't always look right, you know. These wee guys running about. And also in these breeks that are far too big for them, that won't stand up or won't stay up. John Buchan exaggerated unpardonably when he observed that Canada was a larger extension of Scotland. That the Scots wrote so much about pre-Confederation Canada that there may be not another example anywhere of one country being described so relentlessly in terms of another. They produced periodical articles, journals, reports, travelogues, guides for immigrants, memoirs, poetry and novels. Alexander MacLachlan from Johnston in Renfrewshire emigrated in 1840 to become known as the Robert Burns of Canada. He celebrated Canadian Confederation with such compositions as Hurrah for the New Dominion and Young Canada, or Jack's as good as his master. In a long unfinished sequence entitled The Emigrant, he attempted to encapsulate the emigrant experience in verse, a part of his bid to supply a poetic identity for Scotland. Some of his poems, unpublished poems, are in the Metro Toronto Library, and they prove that his radicalism, because he was kicked out for his radicalism from Scotland, accompanied him to the grave. Here's just a bit of one called The Workman's Song. It doesn't require any comment. Come all you weary sons of toil and listen to my song. We've ate oppression's bitter bread and ate it far too long. Oh, poverty's a dreadful thing, her bite is always keen. Oppression's foot is always shod and greed is always mean. The great, the greasy multitude should neither think nor feel. They've but to lick the hand that holds their noses to the wheel. Oh, they forget the blood of Knox is running in our veins, or that we listen to the peasant poet's strains. That's a kind of call to workers unite, and he's actually got poems called things like The Cry of the Oppressed and so on, which I think he had to suppress when he came to Canada. There was to be another Scot who, in his verse, created the vision of Canada which most non-Canadians imagine today, and I refer here to Robert Service, who was born in Lancashire but into a Scottish family and was quickly taken north of the border to be brought up by his grandparents, and went to school at Hillhead and went to Glasgow University and so on. And I had the great privilege in May of this year of being invited out to the Yukon to a conference on the Canadian North in the First World War in order to speak about Robert Service's First World War poetry. Because we all know Robert Service as Dangerous Dan McGrew and all these great poems. But I think that really for the only time in his life, Robert Service confronted his own reality in World War I. He served as an ambulance driver in the middle of the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, which of course was still running 100 years ago today. His book, Rhymes of a Red Cross Man, came out in the fall of 1916, exactly 100 years ago, and he condemned everything about the war and told it like it was in horrific detail. And I can't quote. I'd love to be doing another lecture maybe, but I'll just give you a wee whiff of it. This is his concluding poem in the series, and of course the title gives it away. It's called The Song of the Pacifist. If by the victory all we mean is a broken and brooding foe, is the pomp and power of a glittering hour and a truce for an age or so, by the clay-cold hand on the broken blade we are smitten a bootless blow. If by the triumph we only prove that the sword we sheath is bright, that justice and truth and love endure, that freedom's throned on the height, that the feebler folks shall be unafraid, that might shall never be right. If this be all by the blood-drenched plains, by the havoc of fire and fear, by the rending roar of the war of wars, by the dead so doubly dear, then our victory is a vast defeat, and it mocks us as we cheer. When our children's children shall talk of war as a madness that may not be, when we thank our God for our grief today and blazon from sea to sea, in the name of the dead, the banner of peace, that will be victory. That's Robert Service. Now, what am I doing here? Bill Nicolaisen, a scholar of place names, who said that when you did this sort of thing, you just were turning over blank pages. I'm not, but yeah, I went to this. Right. I mentioned the Enlightenment earlier on. It's always puzzled me, why has there not been more books about the Enlightenment in Canada? It's, I may be wrong in this, but I think I'm not. Americans have been producing books on the Scottish Enlightenment impact on America for 30 years now and longer. And I've only just found 2 books, new ones, in the shops here. And I'm glad to see them. Ted Cowan, Enlightened Zeal, the HBC and Scientific Network 1670 to 1870, which came out in 2014. And another one, Alan Wilson, Highland Shepherd, James McGregor, Father of the Scottish Enlightenment in Nova Scotia, which came out last year. There's got to be more than this. I found a family from a small estate very close to where I live. I only found this just about a week ago before I came away. And it was again like all great historical discoveries, purely by mistake. So this is about a guy called William Brown who left his small estate. The problem with these wee estates was you were small lairds. You didn't really have enough land to support you, and what land you had was poor. So they had to do something else. William Brown moved to America, actually, to what would become the States, studied at university, and then went into the book-making business. By bookmaking, I mean real books, publishing, and book binding and that sort of thing, and printing. And he eventually moved to Quebec, to Quebec City, and really became quite an important individual. He's been studied by Canadians, and when he was getting on, he passed his business to his nephew by the name of Nielsen, who came from a place called Dundrollen, again just down the road from where I live. And these Nielsens were to become the biggest publishers in Quebec, in the province. They published in English and French. They published the first magazine with illustrations in Quebec. They published political journals, but they also published volumes of poetry. They published books. They were heavily influenced by the Folio Society, which Liz was showing here on your screens. They tried to produce nice-looking books, in other words, books that were works of art in their own lives. And they remained there for 3 generations, these Nielsens. People from really nowhere who came to this prominence that they could never have dreamt of if they'd stayed at home. That's the point. How do people realise their abilities move, go away somewhere, disappear? And I want to know more about them, and I will, but that's about as far as I can go with it right now, because I've got to do more work on it. Well, to turn now to the Scottish Studies Foundation. And all of you who ever insulted me in the past are in for it now. One big influence, I think, some of you might remember, was this thing. It was called the Scottish Heritage Festival that we ran in 1983, a wee bit before the foundation was founded. But in 1983, and some of you here will remember it, I'm pretty sure. This was a ridiculously ambitious affair made possible by a grant of $15,000 from the Ontario Heritage Foundation, Ministry of Culture and Citizenship, who, as I recall, actually approached us first. Were we interested in running a Scottish Heritage Festival at Guelph here? Well, it's not often that a government department offers you money, so you say yes, and then think about what could we do. And some of the things we did were We had a downtown parade with a grand Scottish concert dance, Highland dancing and Scottish country dancing finals, Scottish banquet, soccer tournament, ceilidhs, whisky tasting, community picnic, clan booths in the University Centre over here, craft demonstrations, folk concerts, poetry readings, music workshop, exhibitions, and 35 papers on the Scottish experience in Canada. And our three featured speakers were Cliff Hanley, whom some of you will remember, Douglas Campbell, and Cliff Hanley, Adam McNaughton. Adam McNaughton's the guy, the Glaswegian, who wrote the song "You Can't Fling Pieces Out of 20-Story Flat," which some of you will know, and which I would sing to you, but I can't sing. This thing went on, and it was hugely successful. We had no idea at the time, and we probably were stupid in taking the gamble, but the local Army and Navy Club played a large part, but so did many other organisations. However, there had been a beer strike in Ontario, and the Army and Navy guys were running booze trucks down over the border into New York to make sure that we got plentiful supplies of lubricant for the festival, which lasted about 10 days. I don't know how they did it. My own theory was that many of the guys had been in the military, and many of the American border guards had been in the military too. And I think there was a bit of this going on, you know, and they managed to bring this stuff back over the border. This was not like, you know, a six-pack in the back seat of your car. This was vans packed to the gunnels with bottles of beer. Coming over the border, and they supplied the university with them, they supplied the Army and Navy Club and various other venues. This is a story to touch your heart, you must admit. It certainly touches mine. The Cliff Hanley, now deceased, alas, was a journalist who also used the by-name of Ebenezer McElwham, and who wrote great poems such as, and this is the complete poem, "Funny stuff, son, it sticks to your hand." Funny stuff, son, it sticks to your hand. He was a, whenever there was a gap in the programme, we just flung Cliff on. He could speak. If you said speak for 2 minutes, you'd get exactly 2 minutes. If you said 20 minutes, you'd get exactly 20 minutes. Just like that, it would be as funny as hell, or he might make a very serious point. He also talked about his movie, the documentary, Seaward the Great Ships, which he wrote and which won an Oscar for Best Documentary in that year. And he also ran for us a Scottish Film Festival here on campus. Now, he was famous for his jokes, which were kind of urban Glasgow jokes. And I'll pretend that we're past what we call in Britain the 9 o'clock watershed, where you can be a little bit blue, but don't be offended, I am quoting. This one's harmless. He would come up with stories like, it tied in with Adam McNaughton's 20-Story Flat actually, where the kid goes and shouts up to his mother up in the tenement, "Ma, can you give us a piece, a sandwich for my lunch?" And she says, "No, son, I can't give you a piece. Your father's taking the bread knife to the football match." And these days that might be too serious to be funny. He had this one though gave us huge amounts of. This is the one about the woman with the sugary handwriting, and she wrote to Dear Anne Landers or whoever, Sanders, whoever was my agony aunt in one of the papers, and she wrote that, you know, "I've got a terrible problem. My husband cannot keep his hands off me. Whenever I'm washing the dishes, he jumps me just in the kitchen, right there, and insists on having sex. And then she says, when I'm putting out the washing, I get exactly the same thing. It's really terrible. Could you please tell me what I should do about it? P.S. Please excuse the sugary handwriting." Well, see, that one didn't get down very well. Right, moving right along. Anyhow, So far as I recall, and some of you guys here might disagree with this, a few of us began to think about establishing a chair of Scottish Studies. Now, I should stress that the idea of a chair to commemorate the Scottish contribution to Canada did not arise out of any dissatisfaction with the University of Guelph. Au contraire, Guelph could not have been more supportive. When I arrived here in 1979, I was told that if any of my initiatives were successful, the university would take the credit for them. If they failed, then I would get the blame. So I thought, okay, that seems fair. And it's also a good spur to do things that might work out. As a result, we grew in all sorts of ways, but this was one way. This thing with the festival showed us that there was a constituency out there which was really quite interested in things Scottish. But the handle on this, and it took me a long time, maybe some of my colleagues were on this quicker. One of the problems with Scottish society, and probably other societies too in Canada, is that they're pluralistic. Now what that means is that the guy who's interested in playing the pipes is not remotely interested in Scottish history, and the guy that's interested in literature couldn't care less about Scottish country dancing. So you had to try and come up with things that everybody could somehow get involved in. And that is usually music, I suppose, at its widest, or food, or drink, somehow or other. These are the things that brought people together. Community picnics and things like that. And it was probably stuff we had no business to be doing, but it did seem to me to be rather important that we had these folk out there who could, if it was ever going to happen that the university said, no more Scottish studies, it's not worth it, guys, then we would still have an endowed chair, and they could still do what they like with an endowed chair, let's not kid ourselves, but we would be less likely to do it if it was in existence. So, yeah, I think that's how it went. The people I first spoke to were two, and they were Hugh McMillan and Harry Ferguson. Harry's here today, I'm glad to say. Hugh has passed on. Both men were and are great friends of mine. The late Hugh, and many of you will recall him, was a highly colourful figure, and one of the most exasperating individuals I have ever worked with in my match with. He used to don full Highland dress, more resplendent than that worn by any clan chief, including that of his own chief, Clan Macmillan, whether in Scotland or Canada. We used to run tours together to Scotland. I'd be dressed in jeans and a shirt, and Hugh would be there in his kilt, and everybody would come up and ask Hugh for directions. And since clan chiefs had to know everything, he didn't bother which direction he sent them in, because he said, go that way. And I was appalled. I used to go, don't do that, what do you want? That was one thing. He used to love a big sporran. One of these big furry sporrans, made of all the animals that are banned in Canada. And he used to love telling people, that's otter, that comes from a kind of pheasant, and the very fine hair there, right down there, you know what that is, Nancy? He'd say it's the pubic hair of a polar bear. And of course there was always somebody that said, how did you get it? He always said, very carefully. So that was Hugh, and the last story I'll tell about him. And this, I now cannot remember if this happened, but something like it did. He was waiting to cross Avenue Road in Toronto, and there was this wee woman beside him, waiting to cross also, and she looked around and saw Hugh, and she took her handbag and hit him in the stomach with it. Boom! And Hugh said, what did you do that for? She said, you're Farley Moment, and your books are rubbish. And Hugh said, I'm not Farley Moment. She hit him again, she says, you're a liar to boot. Now, if you had a guy like that working for you, you couldn't lose. And then Harry, McShushi himself, where is he? He's here somewhere. Yes, he's still here. I thought he might have gone by now. Harry, a businessman who had long supported the programme at Guelph. He was here. I'm beginning to feel like this, even before I was, you know. They've shown today as if Stanford Reid somehow was here in the distant past and I came right after him. I mean, I'm far too young to be thinking about things that were 30 years ago, honestly. But anyway, Harry, again, is one day when we were swimming in his swimming pool at Oakville, I tried to get a rise out of Harry by saying I never in my wildest dreams expected to be swimming with one of the sharks of Bay Street. And the joke fell apart because Harry took this as a compliment. And I believe he still would. Oh dear, that was really funny. What an idiot I felt. Now, I don't want to name too many people in case I upset others by seeming to leave them out. But in later months and years, as I think you heard, one of my favourite places for meeting was Honest Ed's in Toronto. Honest Ed used to open up for us on a Saturday morning so we could have a Barney, otherwise known as a meeting of the Scottish Heritage Foundation, to talk about what we might be doing. And Honest Ed was quite a character. He used to don a kilt every Rabbi Burns Day, as he said, 25th of January. Another was the headquarters of Barclays Bank in Toronto, courtesy of Alan. We always used to try out the facilities for the day when we'd be directing the bank. That was fun. And then, of course, there were assorted pubs, which I can't even remember them all. There were various places that we went and would meet and have these meetings. There were usually as many suggestions as to how we should proceed as there were people in the room. This is the Scottish facility for founding churches. You know, how many Scots does it take to found? How many ideas does it take to found 2 new Scottish churches? The answer is 1. And that's what was happening here. People would have as many ideas, but they were all different. And often I would drive back to Guelph wondering how in hell Robert Bruce had ever managed to bring a nation together back in the 14th century, because it was impossible to do it in Toronto or anywhere else now. But the payoff was that these meetings were, as I recall, utterly hilarious. At least half of those present would have given Billy Connolly a run for his money any day. So they were somewhat riotous and great fun. And in 1986, we constituted ourselves as the Scottish Studies Foundation. And then the hard work began. Jointly and individually, we punted the foundation wherever possible. A commercial about the foundation would be added to anybody who was giving any extracurricular lectures. On one occasion, my wife and I had just arrived at a motel where we were being accommodated by a group who were having a dinner or something, and I was to speak at it. And the guy phoned up, who was running it, phoned up and said, "What do you drink?" And I said, "Usually I drink heavy, pint heavy." And he said, "What does your wife drink?" "Vodka and orange." "Right." So we went, and 5 minutes later a taxi arrived, or a taxi driver arrived with a pint and a vodka and orange. How we managed to drive them across town, I don't know, but they came in, and that was just to get the evening started. And these kind of stories kept gathering. Yeah. There was another individual, a vote of thanks. I know you have to do this at Scottish events, and they still do it back home as well, that when you have a vote of thanks, you have to make sure it's a long vote of thanks. So you thank everybody. And it's like somebody winning an Oscar, you know. So this one was another one of these things that went on forever. And the pre-saves, if you like, the guy who was presiding over the dinner did not realise that his microphone was still on when he sat down. So he went through the big long list, sat down, and we heard this hoarse whisper from his wife. coming over loud and clear. He didn't thank the piper. He didn't thank the piper. And he looked at his notes and he looked at, and he says, and I'll clean up the language in this one. He says, you shut your geggy. I did thank the so-and-so piper. Everybody erupted. Yeah, just like that. Oh yeah, and one of my favourite venues, if you ever get asked to address the Oshawa Burns Club, don't go. I was asked to go and speak to them just at an AGM, I think, about something or other. And when I got there, the AGM was in progress, and few things are as boring as somebody else's AGM. But at the beginning of the programme, after the meeting, the business part was over, they introduced Old Sandy, and they had a screen like this, and one of these gadgets for music, you know how the wee ball pings along, boom, 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 and they sing a wee song, and it would be Scottish songs that came up, so it would be Over the Sea to Sky or something, so like this. Anyway, they asked Old Sandy if he would give the first song, and I said, and here's Old Sandy, who just emigrated for Stirling. Sandy, I would like to ask you, what do you think the future holds for you here in Canada? And Old Sandy says, death. I've never forgotten. And that same do, I got whatever I was talking about, I can't remember, I got it over with, and as usual, you know, it was real fun and everything else, and everybody was applauding except at these things. Well, same thing will happen here. There's always one face that sits flashing at me. Just sitting, this big guy sitting there right in the middle of the group, just like that. And when it's over, he starts pushing folk out of the road and comes to the front. And I thought he was going to wallop me, you know. Brings his big mitt up. I says, put it there. He says, that's the best speech that I ever heard by any effing history professor ever. He says, in fact, I think it's the only speech I ever heard by anyone. So he joined, immediately signed up for the Scottish Studies Foundation. And we had him up to the chamber in Barclays Bank instantly. Well, oh yes, one could go on like this all night, and I won't do it. Just one note to be aware of. The dancers of Aberfoyle. They sound like a troop. They were a pain in the neck. The guy phoned me up every day for a week to tell me, first of all, I was supposed to do a speech of the memory at Burns Supper, and he phoned up on the Monday and says, how long do you usually take? I said, that's up to you. He says, well, what would you think? I said, usually 20 minutes is good. Right, 20 minutes. Tuesday he phones up, I've just been to consult, and 20 minutes seems a wee bit long, make it 15. Wednesday he phones up, I think maybe we should just do 10 minutes. So we ended up with 5 minutes at the end so they could dance. That's a good example of how dancers are not interested in anything else except dancing. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Yeah. And I didn't go to find money from them, but I was tickled pink on one occasion, and I'm nearly done, yeah. Tickled pink on one occasion to be asked to address a bunch of young Mennonites over in Waterloo, and to find that they had exactly the same sense of humour, really, as the Scots. So when I gave them the old definition of the Scot who insists on keeping the Sabbath and anything else he can lay his hands on, the Mennonites said, oh, we have exactly the same definition of a Mennonite. So there's a bond for you. Sign them up. But the funds came dreadful slow. And it was only when we recruited people who seemed to me to actually understand money and had some sense of giving something back that the campaign became successful. Nevada tickets, I think they were called, played a big part here. I can authoritatively report that some Scots are tight-fisted, so tight-fisted that they cost the rest of us a fortune to live down their reputations. But mostly when money was mentioned, I mean, a lot of Scots would say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, get a chair at Guelph, aye, that's a great idea. You ask them to contribute, there's a stampede for the door. However, they kept the heat, and we soon recruited people like Alan McKenzie and Bill Somerville and David Hunter, all of whom are here tonight, this afternoon, and many others, who really put us on the right track, I think. In the later stages, for my part in it, which was minor, we overlapped with a campaign that was building to have Canada adopt Tartan Day. You remember on the slides, Jean Watson, that he very sensibly made Scot of the Year. And she was a lady just from Halifax who thought there should be another Scottish day in the calendar, a more convenient time than either Robert Burns' birthday or St Andrew's Day in November. So she picked April 6th, which is the anniversary of the Declaration of Arbroath. Well, when this started to move, this particular campaign on Tartan Day, sometimes we overlapped with it. There's no question about it. So you would try and make a pitch just to inform people that these things existed at one and the same time. At the same time too, Scotland was entering a kind of a cultural revolution, I think, by the late 80s, which was partly a reaction against Maggie Thatcher and people like that. And it would gradually build into the 90s, into the whole campaign, political campaign for nationalism. But personally, I always thought that the cultural revolution, if you like, came first before the political one. That there was a new confidence. One thing that had struck me when I left the old country, I think in the first Saturday's Globe and Mail that I opened, the middle pages were, "Is there a true Canadian literature?" And I'd swear that the weekend before in the Scotsman back in Edinburgh, "Is there a true Scottish literature?" We had exactly the same angst and agonies and reflections about what's Canadian literature, what's Scottish literature. And just as Canadians have given up on that, I think, so too had the Scots. Certainly by the early 90s, they were much more confident. They didn't mind where the music came from. You didn't have to stamp every book, this is by a Scottish writer. Paintings were international, and so it went. So there was a new confidence coming there, which soon spilled over into politics and what have you. But I think my own personal greatest contribution to the Foundation campaign was to return to Scotland in 1993, because after I went, they started to gather funds in great quantities, and I can only assume that there's a cause and effect. So that's where I want to leave it, and thanks very much for listening.